fruit bruise is. So it's something that you might see at harvest and notice, but then it increases over time in storage. Now, I'm going to start focusing a little bit more on other disorders, but I want to also mention that when we see sunburn in the field, the fruit that has mild sunburn or even is just sun exposed, it will generate, in the case of susceptible varieties like Granny Smith, sun scald, and you see a picture of it on your left. Another disorder that also has the same root is stain, and that happens mostly in Fuji's. There's some publications we have had with this disorder. So yeah, the problem is that sun scald doesn't have any control, stain doesn't either, and nothing reduces its incidence, and you can see it without the room temperature period. You see it right after the fruit, while the fruit is in cold conditions. The more sunburn, the more sun scald you have post-harvest, and the earlier in the storage season appears on the fruit. Symptoms are restricted to the areas where the fruit was sun exposed directly or with sunburn symptoms. So on top here, you can see that sunburn levels on Granny Smith, and below you can see sun scald development on top of those sun affected areas on the fruit. On your right, you see a tray affected by sun scald. And so the other situation, maybe if you're an apple person, is that you might think that this is superficial scald, right? Controlled by DPA, diphenylamine, or ethoxyquin in the case of pears, or 1-MCP, but it's not. And of course, DPA or 1-MCP is not going to control sun scald. So this is an important part here. It's just ID. You have to identify the disorders correctly to be able to fix it. And probably the next season, not the season where you see them. Another group of disorders you will see on hot weather summers, or hot summers and dry summers, especially in those where you have those huge heat waves, is senescence related disorders. And you can see all these different type of browning. A lot of them, of course, have the component of advanced maturity and senescence on that fruit. So I'm not going to go into details of them, but maturity is a big factor. And if the season is warm and hot, you will harvest with the same maturity indices, but you will have a fruit that has a more advanced maturity at the time that you harvest and then put them into storage, and wanting for that fruit to last 12 months. Because even for organic apples here in Washington, the goal is to store them 10 to 12 months. And so they are, they are pushed to keep that fruit long, to supply the different markets. And so you post-harvest people have to do miracles sometimes to get that fruit to last, or just deal with 40% of culls while the time, in a long-term storage condition. Okay, another thing that I talked about is, the hot weather, the advanced maturity due to that prior you store that fruit, is the acclimation to cold storage that you will need. And that really modulates, right? Because we do acclimation on apples and in different varieties. We do it on Honeycrisp here. Condition that fruit with higher temperature prior going into cold storage, or a stepwise cooling, right? And you will affect in warm seasons and hot summers, these process, and it's going to be affected. And some of the chilling injury disorders that are treated or you want to reduce it with acclimation are internal browning, superficial scald, soft scald, and other skin brownings that are chilling injury disorders. And this is really understanding that all of them are multifactorial, because that is the case. So you will have differences in response of the fruit for that acclimation. Now, I'm going to talk, this is an interesting variety, Honeycrisp. I started working on Honeycrisp when I got here in 2019, but of course, Randy Baudry and Chris Watkins and my colleagues here in Washington have been working on Honeycrisp, and Canada for a long time. And it's a beautiful apple because it just deals with two different issues. This variety is usually recommended to be conditioned, right? That means 7 to 10 days at 50 degrees Fahrenheit prior being placed in storage at 37 Fahrenheit. If you do the conditioning, you reduce chilling injury stress, right? Chilling stress, and you will reduce then the chilling injury disorder, such as soft scald and soggy breakdown, right? But if you condition, you also may have, of course, an increase of those disorders like bitter pit, this is a very susceptible variety because you are advancing maturity with this conditioning period, right? We want to reduce metabolic activity with cooling and chilling right away after harvest. And in this case, you are not for the first 7 to 10 days. So you are increasing metabolic activity and ethylene production, and you tend to have more bitter pit, right? That's the idea behind. Now, if you do not condition, you fast cool, lower that storage temperature right away, place the fruit in low temperature right away. You do lower respiration. You do reduce bitter pit disorders that ethylene is critical, but you increase chilling related disorders, right? And you will see more soft scald and soggy breakdown. But then, with different climates and seasonal climates during the different seasons are different, you don't really know if that fruit is really susceptible to chilling related disorders. And you might just do conditioning because that's the thing you have to do for this variety to reduce that soft scald. And so then you start seeing very strange things. And I'm going to just share with you some of the results of this project that we conducted for 3 years, post-harvest system optimization for organic apple storage. And we did this with my colleague, Jim Matthias. And for this project, we harvest fruit from 4 different commercial blocks from the same group of trees every year. And according to the companies or the collaborators we got, two of them were warm sites and 2 of them were cool sites. So that was a good thing because we really wanted to see what was the difference from the fruit coming from those different sites here in Washington. And we did this for 3 seasons. So I'm going to share some of the results that we saw, and I'm going to focus on the the heat wave event, which was the season 2021 and post-harvest in 2022. So we did store fruit from all these 4 different sites, and this is air stored fruit. And on green bars, it's conditioned fruit. In orange bars is the non-conditioned fruit. So placed right away at 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And here you would expect that conditioned fruit should have less incidence of soft scald, but you don't, right? You see really that the green bars right here showing average and a standard error, the green bars are higher than the orange bars. And then the other thing you see is one of the blocks, C21, which the company said it was a cool site, had the most compared to the others. W42, which is also a warm site, also has a little bit. It's the second highest. Okay. Now, on your right, again, the same graph, and on your left here, you see fruit that it was stored in CA regimes. There were 2 or 3 different treatments that we did with 3% oxygen and 0.5% CO2. And you right away see that comparing air stored fruit with CA stored fruit, you get a decrease on soft scald, definitely, right? And also C21, which is one of the blocks, had higher than the rest. So at least if you store Honeycrisp and CA, you will have a decrease on these disorders. And this was 9 months of storage plus 4 weeks in air, plus 1 and 7 days for the evaluation. Another thing I want to tell you is that when we looked at the weather data, and that is growing degree days or growing degree days plus or temperature plus relative humidity. Another bioindex that I use, bioclimatic index, C21, which was supposed to be a cool site. It wasn't cool site at all. It was a warm site, and it was actually warmer than W42. And that also, destroys, what sometimes we read in the literature, that cool sites are also where you see the highest soft scalds. So at least when the growing season is hot and extreme, some of the things we know about physiological disorders don't really make sense when we go into that storage season. This is also, I want to show you, well, those are 2021, 2022 season heat wave event, 2020, 2021, which was the previous season, very little soft scald. We still see a high, one of the highest with C21, but not when it was stored in CA, but very little. I mean, you see here in air stored fruit, which is the one on your right, up to 6%, 8% soft scald, which is much lower than the season after, where the heat wave hit the summer. So bitter pit, what happened? Well, in this, the theory tells me that conditioned fruit should have more bitter pit. And so those are the green bars, and that's what we see, right? In general, if we look at all the different time points during that air storage, which is intervals of 2 weeks, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, up to 16 weeks, all the different blocks, we tend to see that the green bars are higher. And actually, so more bitter pit. And in this case, definitely, again, block dependent. So W42, the highest, and that was actually what we saw all the years. And then the other thing we saw is that conditioned fruit was less firm, was much more soft than non-conditioned fruit, and had a little bit less acidity on the fruit, which also was block dependent. I have so many other results that I'm not going to share this time with you regarding this project, because it was really, really enlightening of how those different climates and different seasons can have different outcomes post-harvest. This is the other comparison. You see the same graph on your right with air store fruit that season, the 21-22, and on your left, there's CA. Now, right away, you can see that the same, of course, block pattern incidence, because it was the same fruit going into air and CA storage. And also it's a little bit higher, definitely, on the air store fruit than in CA. So you're also with CA, you are suppressing some of that potentially expression of bitter pit with CA conditions. Okay, another thing I want to show you is that the 2021 season, which was the previous season where we had very low incidence of soft scald, we had a lot of bitter pit. So bitter pit would be much less affected by the seasonal climate. And we saw also that this year, I'm going to comment on that a little bit later, but it's very block dependent. C21 and C802, the lowest incidence of bitter pit on when fruit was stored on air or on CA. Now, since we had that project from 3 years, different sites, we also measured all these different tree variables and mineral nutrition on the skin prior harvest, on the fruit peel. We try to do multivariate analyses to see if we can link the incidence of soft scald to some of those varieties, including the climate or bitter pit, and we didn't find anything. It's not, all these 3 different seasons of that project was totally different. And we just need a higher number of seasons to be able to see something, to connect the outcome post-harvest regarding those 2 disorders and pre-harvest conditions. The only thing on your right you see here is what I already told you, that C21, the fruit from block C21 had the highest the highest soft scald compared to the rest, but that already we had seen it in the other analyses. Okay, another thing I want to share is that this block, the W42, we are continuing to work with it, fruit from the same group of trees. So I'm going to have 4 more years of data on the same group of trees, and that's going to be great. This is the pre-harvest movement, right? Progression of different maturity indices. On your left, you see the absorbent difference index. Then you see firmness, internal ethylene concentration, malic acid content, and starch index. And I just want to point out to you that internal ethylene concentration this season, 2022, it was incredibly high on those Honeycrisp at harvest. And we started seeing that 2 weeks prior. You see in this block, it was 1 week before harvest. Ethylene was almost 5 ppm in average, but some of the fruit was almost 10 ppm. And so Honeycrisp are not in good shape this year due to climate. So what happened with the climate? I show you already the season 2020, 2021, where we had very low soft scald. And that year we had a huge smoke event here in Washington, which is another problem that we have on and off in different seasons. And that smoke hit at harvest. So that fruit was pretty immature, producing no ethylene, and it stayed like that for a while post-harvest. I was worried about it. I took my ethylene samples to another lab, and it was the same value. So the fruit was pretty much very, very calm post-harvest and very good quality afterwards. 2021, the heat wave in June, and you saw the results in some of my previous slides. In 2022, the current season, where when you see that spike in ethylene at harvest and pre-harvest on these honeys from this block, we had a cold spring, frost during spring, a very long bloom time, and then also heat waves that were smaller than 2021, but at least 2 of them in June, July. A little smaller because they were 10 degrees Fahrenheit lower than the previous year, and they were closer to harvest with cooler nights. Well, apparently the fruit this year has a lower density and therefore soften really fast right before harvest, and at harvest produce a lot of ethylene and everything else. It's actually, the advanced maturity is showing up now in the storage season. And I just mentioning a little bit more detail about this season and the sustained heat in June, July. I already said that. Differences in microclimates for sure here in Washington. And what are we seeing this year is higher susceptibility for bruising for Honeycrisp, a big issue at harvest because fruit was already in advanced maturity, high scuffing in pears, and skin greasiness in some varieties that don't really have greasiness prior harvest or at harvest, and they show it after during the storage season. But again, this is a lot microclimate based. So some areas with more environmental stress will show more of these issues. Okay, now I'm going to go on to pears, and I'm going to just focus on superficial scald, and I'm going to focus on winter pears, anju pears in the case of the ones, the number 1 here in Washington. And people that work on superficial scald have seen this diagram from Chris, Lurie, and Watkins. It's great because it explains very easily how this happens, but this is a chilling injury. So when fruit apples and pears go into cold storage, they suffer stress. And so systems work after that happens. Ethylene produces ethylene affects the alpha-farnesene synthesis. That goes up. That alpha-farnesene oxidizes into trianols, and some of the hydroperoxide and the peroxide end up damaging the tissue, the skin. If you peel that fruit, there is no symptoms underneath. So no flesh symptom, but yes, outside. And you can see also some of the control treatments, 1-MCP, heat, acclimation treatments for the fruit to go down in temperature slowly and be able to adapt to acclimate to those new conditions, and DPA and synthetic antioxidants, DPA and ethoxyquin. And there are other antioxidants also involved in the biochemical pathway of tissue injury. So what are mitigating factors for this disorder? First of all, and as you know, in apples, there are susceptible varieties such as Granny Smith, very high, Red Delicious, Fuji's, and others. And then in pears, Anjou pears, definitely, and Pacum Triumph, which is the #1 winter pear in Chile, which a variety that I've worked on, and others such as Abate, Fetel, and other pears, but those are the most susceptible one. And what happens again, you get the skin browning, hypodermal cell necrosis, and it's visible after the fruit has been placed in cold storage, but definitely expresses more when the fruit is at room temperature. Especially on pears, this can happen up to 14 days after the fruit has been placed at room temperature. And what do we know about this disorder? There are pre-harvest factors involved, and actually the season weather is involved. The more cold units, the less susceptible the fruit is, and that in the past have been determined that is temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit prior harvest. Within the month prior harvest, it will decrease fruit susceptibility because it is more acclimated to the cold conditions they will get post-harvest. So in a very warm season, fruit do not get this cold acclimation prior harvest, and it is more susceptible to the cold post-harvest. Harvest maturity is also important, and apples and pears seem to behave totally different, right? The more immature apples are, the more superficial scald. In pears, apparently, and that is actually seasonal dependent, the more ripened or the more mature the pear is at harvest, the more superficial scald it gets. And then, of course, the post-harvest storage temperature, the lower it is, the more superficial scald you're going to get. So storing the fruit to higher storage temperature, 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, you will get a decrease on superficial scald development, but you're going to get a fruit with a worse condition and quality overall after post-harvest, later in storage. And then it is controlled by synthetic antioxidant. Traditionally, DPA and ethoxyquin have been used for apples and pears, but these are disappearing, right? I mean, they're still used here in conventional growing fruit here in Washington, but Europe doesn't allow anything treated with DPA or ethoxyquin. And for Chile, it is something to, of course, and it just took those antioxidants away, DPA on apples and pears, because they never know where the fruit is going to go. And if it goes to Europe, it cannot if it's treated. And then 1-MCP, which is also effective, but sometimes, I mean, to be really effective, it needs to be applied properly, and sometimes filling out those big rooms, 1,000, 1,500, 200, 2,000 bin rooms, it takes a while, and then the optimum time where you apply the chemical is not right, and efficacy against superficial scalds, it is reduced. And again, heat prior harvest, less acclimation to cold, and higher maturity rate, 2 of the things that will increase fruit susceptibility to superficial scald. So this is what we know from information here in the Pacific Northwest. The more mature the pear, the Anjou pear is at harvest, the more scald. But that really doesn't happen always. And also, I just want to point out in this slide is that the harvest, the different harvest maturity determined, and this was work done in Hood River, fruit firmness is the only maturity index used for this purpose. So they start with the earliest fruit being harvested at 15 pounds and the last one at 12 pounds. But again, winter pears are more complex, and just focusing or to determine maturity by firmness is a tricky one. And then 1-MCP for pears, it's really something that they don't use here in the Pacific Northwest. unless the fruit is going to be stored late, I mean, it's going to stay in storage longer. And the one that's actually stored longer, even with those 1 MCP sachets, but really they don't want to use it because they they fail to ripen. And the dose for 1 MCP is low. It's 10 to 100 to 300 ppv on pears. But yeah, it's just the maturity at the time of application varies. It's not well determined, and then the effect of it is just not predictable sometimes. We also have a pear article talking about the factors pre-harvest determining how susceptible the fruit is at different harvest maturities on Pacum triumph, which is also a winter pear. Okay, so in this project that I'm going to just show you some of the results, it was a project that was funded by the Fresh and Processed Pear Committee here in Washington. And it was led by my colleague, Dr. Rudell. And we had Dr. Jingi Ju, which postdoctoral researchers that stayed with us 3 years. And we got great results. We work with different pears growing in different environments here in Washington. They're very different when they're grown here in the Wenatchee area or compared to those grown in the mid-Columbia, which is the Hood River area, or in Yakima. They're totally different in susceptibility to superficial scald. And so it's a good group of different growing fruit growing regions for this type of projects. And in this one, we were testing new active ingredients to prevent superficial scald. Post-harvest, this active was actually, I worked in Chile with this for 7 years. And so in Pacum triumphs was very effective, and it's natural. And the idea of this was to replace DPA and ethoxyquin for pears. It is a coating that is drenched, but I'm not going to talk about the effect necessarily of this antioxidant or the new molecule that I'm talking about to prevent superficial scald. But what did we see in the different seasons? So in 2019 and 2020 was a warm season, and we did see, what we know about superficial scald on pears. And let's see, for example, in Wenatchee, on your left, you have 6 months of storage, after 6 months of storage results, and on your right, 8 months of storage results. So if we think about the literature, the more ripened the pear is at harvest, or mature the pear is at harvest, the more superficial scald. Well, in the Wenatchee area, H1, which is the first harvest, and H2, which is the second harvest, we didn't see any difference in incidence of superficial scald between those two different maturity at harvest. The black bars are the control, and the red bars are the one applied with the different antioxidants. The red is squalane, the product that we've been testing, and the green bars are the ethoxyquin. So in the Hood River area, which are the graphs on the bottom, you see that the more mature the fruit it is at harvest, the less superficial scald after 6 months, and a little bit less after 8 months. So really those two sites, pears coming from those two sites, behave differently in terms of what fruit is more susceptible to superficial scald. Okay, this is a picture of those different treatments and a different fruit from two different sites. Now, what happened that was 2019, 2020. In 2020, 2021, the year of the smoke, remember, and not the heat wave, we had no superficial scald on the Wenatchee area, but yes, we did on the Hood River pears. And in those pears, scald appeared after 6 months in CA plus 2 weeks in air, and stayed pretty high thereafter, around 80%. So it was a lot of superficial scald, but in Hood River, but no superficial scald on Wenatchee. That year too, we could actually delay the drench of the emulsion, which is the new antioxidant, new anti-scalding compound that we were working on, up to 3 months with fruit stored at 1% oxygen, and we could still control superficial scald, which is on the top figure there. We did that with the anti-scalding compound and the ethoxyquin. Okay, what happened the year of the heat wave, 2021 and 2022? Well, first of all, you can see the Hood River on your left pears, on your right, your Wenatchee pear. So this year we did have superficial scald on Wenatchee pears, and we had a lot of superficial scald, right? We had in Hood River, there was 4 orchards, which are 01 through 04, and all of them had a good amount of superficial scald being expressed after 7 days at room temperature and 8 months of storage. And then the control method we use to reduce superficial scald, which is the bar next to the bar with dots, they didn't really were that effective in any of the orchards. But then again, we saw, and I'm going to show you, we weren't sure if that was all superficial scald. This is how they looked, the pears. Very bad condition that year after 8 months and 7 days at room temperature, 14 days at room temperature. And again, when we're talking about superficial scald, we see no scald in the sun-exposed area, and we see all the scald on the unexposed area. So that's what we are expecting to see when we are looking at superficial scald. Well, that year, we had a scald type, right, on the, on the sun exposed area, and nothing, in other pears that had this didn't have anything on the back, on the unexposed. So it doesn't seem like a superficial scald. And that is +7 day, and you can see here at 14 days, it was terrible because that area was also affected by rots by then. So very bad condition of the pear. And so again, when this happened, I had published a couple papers on sun scald on pears coming fruit from Chile. And really, that had not been recorded here in Washington. And it's the same phenomena as sun scald on apples, right? It just appears on the sun exposed section of the fruit. And in the case of pear, only on the fruit that has some level of sunburn, has no control, no DPA or 1-MCP. And it started like anecdotal, right? Because they would say, oh, we're still getting superficial scald, even if we treat the pears with DPA in Chile. Then Argentina had the issue and increasing over the years, where the climate change had hit really bad, and those growing seasons have several heat waves. And it's just a problem that it's increasing, especially in those trees that have the fruit exposed to direct sunlight, and then lack of water in some cases. So I thought about that right away, that it was sun scald, but it was a very unique season for those pears. The only thing I want to show you, I'm not going to focus on biochemistry, but we have seen that some phenolics are related only to sun scald, and others are related to sun scald and sunburn. So there is something unique going on with phenolics, just as in apples, where you see those changes in the phenolic profile when the fruit develops sun scald. Now, what else did we see that 2021, 2022? Well, we are talking about, when the fruit is most susceptible to superficial scald on angiopeirs pears, and already I did talk about Packham triumphs, and I published that in the papers. But in general, the knowledge here was that the more mature pears had more superficial scald. And what we saw that year, with one of the experiments, that the superficial scald susceptibility increases until the optimal harvest time, which is age 3, But then a week later it was still susceptible, right? You can see that with levels of up to 70–80% of superficial scald, and then decrease after 2 weeks of harvest. So, what we think that fruit about superficial scald disorder on pears doesn't really apply, and it's really very not common or weird on the years that we have heat during the growing season. Another thing we did see on this experiment, you have still the anti-scaldic compound here, the green bar, and the ethoxyquin, the red bar. We store these fruit region and then place them 1 month in air, and we did still see control using those two different anti-scalding compounds compared to the untreated control. This is another experiment, changing or combining control methods with water temperature to get more acclimation on the fruit. And yes, it is effective. So in years with high stress, less acclimated fruit, you might want to combine different treatments to decrease superficial scald development on fruit. Delayed application. This year you could see an effect of those anti-scalding compounds if you delayed the application for 4 weeks. But after that, the superficial scald increased and treated in untreated fruit. So it did only, it was only effective up to 4 weeks in air to be able to delay the application of anti-scalding. Another thing we saw that year was black speck, and this had been reported in pears, in angial pears grown in Hood River area. So Oregon State University researchers have published on this, but my colleagues here in Washington have never seen it. But this year there was a lot of black speck. You see this one, it was also the harvest maturity dependent. And with H4, which was 1 week late harvest, from the optimal time, you get the highest event of black speck on that fruit. You see that is almost 50%. We did see a reduction of the black speck using the anti-scalding compounds. So then again, we are wondering if this was just another expression of superficial scald, instead of something more related to CO2 injury or low oxygen problem, and we don't know up to now. Fun things up here in very stressful seasons. And then the other thing is that this disorder was located mostly on the shade side of the fruit, and you can see that on the picture there. So yes, we are still wondering if maybe we're going to get this event again repeated and be able to study it more. But then again, here you can see the pattern of superficial scald expression and development and the black speck, and it's pretty much, it's similar. Okay, another thing we saw that year is something pretty unique, and it's that the fruit angial pears, they have a chilling requirement to be able to ripen, start producing ethylene, right? So the winter pears, they harvest hard and green, and then they need some time post-harvest of chilling conditions to be able to ripen at the end and produce ethylene and change texture and color, right? Well, this year, right after harvest, several commercial lots were able to ripen after 7 and 14 days, and ripen meaning a soft texture and then yellow skin. So they didn't require any chilling conditions to ripen, which is really odd, never happens. And then so beautiful pears, very ready to eat right away, which is what they want every season, but yeah, not feasible with winter pears. And then the other thing we saw on those commercial lots is that in February, so 4 to 5 months of storage, there were some of the lots from the area of Hood River, mid-Columbia, had ton of superficial scald. So they were already senescing and old after 4 or 5 months. So they were harvested with the same firmness that year, but they were in a more advanced maturity stage, definitely due to the weather, the hot weather, that growing season. This year, 2022, pears are not ripened after harvest, right after harvest, and they were green and hard after 7 and 14 days at room temperature. So totally different climate. All right, so I'm not sure how long, yeah. Okay, so final remarks. Extreme heat and seasonal climate during the growing season greatly affect fruit maturity and fruit quality post-harvest. And that translate into a lack of, consistency of post-harvest treatment and different outcomes with different cold chain scenarios. And that is something that's going to happen more frequently due to the climate change in different parts of the US. So Washington is being hit, so California, of course, and even Canada, they're very worried about it because some of those summers are very hot and they are not used to that type of heat up there, right? Sun scald is not apples harvest disorder, also exclusive to apples. And as I show you, it can appear on pears. We need to understand a little bit more the sun scald on pears here in Washington, or, think about just to try to describe, what superficial scald, what is superficial scald like disorder, and what's sun scald. And then sun scald on pears in Chile, and here too appeared after, well, in Chile mostly appeared only after 2 and 3 months into cold storage, and nothing controls it, and only on sun-injured fruit, compared to apples that you can have sun scald on only sun-exposed sections of the fruit with no sunburn. So it's a little bit less susceptible, definitely, than apples, but it can be there. And I've heard that in Argentina, they're having a lot of sun scald on pears, on Pack and Triumphs, and they're very worried about it because it doesn't have any control. And, you just have to think about how you're going to manage that cold chain, supply chain, right? What are you going to do with that fruit to be able to decrease the amount of fruit that goes to culls? Thank you very much for attending this webinar, and I just want to finish acknowledging my post-harvest system lab group. Without them, I could not do my research and my funding here in Washington from the industry and collaborators. They're great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolina. You open for some questions? So if folks have questions for Carolina, please post them on the Q&A or the chat down below, and either she or I will read through them and see what we can address. And while we're waiting for people to do a little bit of typing, Carolina, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question for you, and it had to do with the conditioning of your Honeycrisp early on. I think you said you showed that the conditioned fruit had more of the soft scald in the leftmost panel, I think, from the 4 blocks. Yeah. So for the first time since I've been here at Michigan State and been working with Honeycrisp this year, we had a tremendous amount of browning, internal browning, in this case, soggy breakdown, but on Honeycrisp that had been conditioned properly and stored at the appropriate temperatures. We didn't really have an odd year in terms of temperature necessarily, but would you like to comment on that conditioning experiment?
Yes, and when I started getting these results, I was worried. I'm like, oh my God, we have to see, maybe somebody made a mistake. Are you sure these are the conditioning? Then I talked to Jim Matthias, and he said, oh yeah, we've seen this before in some seasons, but the most conservative recommendation we can do to our industry is just condition, right? Not think about the season, because if that is what works most of the times. So I guess it's something we do get here in Washington, and definitely, at least now, when I compare different seasons, I have another season coming out now, that when it's hot, right, and dry and stressful, conditioning is not going to help, right? I mean, that would be the last thing I could say. So think about not conditioning the years where these are the pre-harvest climate. But I'm not there yet, right? I can't just tell them that, because if they have a mess, then it's my fault.
Yeah.
But yeah, apparently, stressful growing season. Now, the other thing when I talk about stressful growing seasons, I will be looking at different times during that growing season where the stress happens. And because that might definitely have an impact on what we're talking about, which is the post-harvest quality. One thing that there's no literature is, for example, smoke. And so when I had that smoke event and really good quality fruit throughout storage season and pre-harvest, I started looking at the wine, of course, the grape, the wine people that have ton of work. And I talked with my colleagues here in Tri-Cities that they're doing, studying smoke effect on wine grapes, plants, of course, and then the wine. But they said that usually they see less ripened grapes when they have smoke. And that totally relates with what I saw, which was no ethylene from fruit, no change post-harvest. So, and then the other thing you have to think then is, how big the maturity, the metabolic condition of that fruit related to maturity or in ripening, the effect of that on our disorders post-harvest, because it may be huge, more than we think. Anyways.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we do have a bunch of questions. So the first one came in from Robert Call. He asked about recommendations for applying sunburn protection products. And so I think that's a good climate change related.
Yes. And I try to stay away from that, but I can escape from my previous life. And I would say that there is some evidence definitely that if you do apply products to protect fruit from sunburn, use the mesh, use overhead sprinkles or fog, which is also something else that they're doing now, you will reduce the stress on the fruit. You will reduce some scald incidence. So now I have another project on that, different measures to reduce sunburn and the effect of post-harvest. We're in the second year. We haven't seen a lot differences, between treatments, but yeah, I will have that more figured out in another year or so.
Yeah, it's nice to know that there's still more coming. I love it. Federico Sanchez follows up with kind of a comment along the same lines. He says, colored photoselective polyethylene netting, for example, blue and red, is translucent, allowing only certain wavelengths, but it has a diffusion effect and has been researched to protect ripening fruits. Have you considered a combination of these nettings plus antioxidants or drenching?
For sunburn, yeah. Well, again, I'm going to say that my experience is whatever you use to reduce the load of stress on that fruit pre-harvest will benefit fruit condition. Now, there are some caveats there, right? Because fruit under net sometimes tend to be softer than fruit outside the net. So yeah, so there are, and then of course the skin color, which is not a maturity index, right? It's a harvest index and quality index. And that is something that we, not confused, right? We can't be confused. And then waiting for red color means maturity is advancing, right? In most of the cultivars, apple cultivars. So yeah, so my experience with also application of antioxidant in the field or other stuff, it's marginal, the benefit. So yeah, I'm going to say that yes, if you use one or two things to reduce the amount of stress, it's a good thing for fruit quality and then going into post-harvest. But yeah, it depends on, and then the effect might be marginal.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
And and Cindy Tong had kind of a follow-up question to that. Are there growers commercially using some of these shading technologies?
Yes, they are. Okay. They are not in every variety, but they are for Honeycrisp for sure. But there are some blocks without it too, and they just use fog or other not the shade. So, but they are using.
Okay. And I think it looks like Robert Call had kind of a similar sort of question. So we'll just skip on to what Toctum has here. So she says, would you please elaborate on warm and cold sites? So That's a little different
Perfect.
than a warm and a cold year.
Yes,
So would you like to talk
perfect.
just a little bit about that?
Right. And when I started that project, and I had been working with that in Chile in one site, but so I had to have different seasons. But here I said I'm going to pick this different growing sites with different climates or weathers patterns, and I'm going to be using that instead of the years. And again, when I asked the companies, they said, well, this is a cool site, this is a warm site, and they're in their head that is based on how fast the maturity advances on those sites, and growing degree days mostly. And my experience in Chile is when you compare sites and seasons only with growing degree days, you don't get necessarily the stress level that plant and that fruit is the stress index, which is vapor pressure deficit, so temperature combined with humidity. And it's a much better representation of what's a cool and what's a warm site. And again, as I mentioned before, the C21, which is one of the worst sites for soft scald, they have said it was a cool site. But none of my 3 years, that was a cool site. It was warmer than one of the warm sites. So yeah, warm site, it's defined by the growing degree day accumulation, and for them, of course, so temperature profile, and then what they harvest before or later, right? The more accumulation they harvest before than the lower accumulation.
It's 1:00. I know I've got to leave in just a couple of minutes. Maybe there are a few more questions. So Carolina, I don't know if you can take a snapshot of them and maybe get back to some
Yes.
of the folks there about their questions.
Do you see that one MCP has a benefit on pears? I think it does, but it is tricky with winter pears. You have to know what you're doing. And here they tend to use it in fruit that is stored longer, but a lot of them, most of them do not use 1-MCP on Anjou pears. In Chile, they use it on Packham Triumph, and apparently they got the dial for it, and it's working okay. But it's a tricky one. Reduce sun scald, the post-harvest disorder, because sun scald is also called to the sunburn on apples, but there's no control. Pre-harvest to reduce sun scald, which is sunburn, pruning, irrigation, spray of calcium. Calcium doesn't do anything. Pruning, yes, because you need to work with the tree architecture. If you expose more fruit, you're going to have more sunburn and then sun scald. So yes, you have to worry about irrigation. Yes, you don't want to add one more stress. You already have high temperature, high light. You don't want to add lack of water to decrease that temperature on the fruit from inside, right? Heat on color development versus starch index. That's a good question. One thing that I've learned in all my years in Chile and here is that you never can rely on one maturity index, because they progress in different ways, different seasons. Because they are more or less dependent on ethylene and on the amount of ethylene in the system. So it gets really complex. So sometimes some seasons, and in my W3042 there, you get a pretty the 3 seasons, I got a good decline on chlorophyll degradation, right? But starch index was not the same. Firmness, softening is also goes its own way. So I'm going to say that you don't get a good correlation between one and another every single year. Does month or time of fruit development at which are exposed to excellent question, Cindy. And I don't know yet. I mean, that would be the next step. A month or time of fruit development at which fruit are exposed to high temperature affect post-harvest disorder. Yes, that's my next thing. But it's going to take me years to see if I can see something. Any abiotic stress inhibitor like salicylic acid for overcoming superficial scald. I work, yes, I mean, I see, in my work, I've seen that phytohormones have a pattern, they have a pattern pre-harvest and post-harvest, and they're affecting the level of stress that the fruit, or they're representing the level of stress that the fruit has. And even ethylene, before the fruit starts to mature, it is also present at the time of stress. And you can see that even in the same fruit that is sun exposed and unexposed. But some of the literature that I've seen with salicylic acid or jasmonic acid on, it's not quite clear. So consistent either. Maybe the nature, the chemical nature of the phytohormone that it was applied didn't allow that to go in the cell and do what it needs to do, which I think it's a big part of the efficacy of some of these products. So yeah, I mean, I think there is more than just, I know they are triggering responses, and you can measure that. And I've done it pre and post harvest, but the effect of applying it or inhibiting it is just another story. I don't see any more questions.
And we probably have to stop it there anyway. I know I need to walk out of my office in like 1.5 minutes. Yes. So, Carolina, thank you so much. Really nice, very broad and inclusive presentation. So if you like pears, you got pears. You like apples, you got apples. You got heat, you got heat. You got cold. Wonderful. I'm loving it. Yeah, loved it. Yeah, it was really nice. I know we don't have an applause button, but if I could, I would hit that applause button. It was really
thank you so
much appreciated. Yeah.
Recording stopped.
So, have yourself a great day.
Yes, thank you both. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Carolina.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.